The night sky over Carlsbad, New Mexico, in the late summer of 1942 was alive with movement. A dark river of wings flowing against the dying light, thousands upon thousands of Mexican free-tailed bats pouring from the mouth of the cavern like smoke from an ancient fire. Lightless, Adams stood there watching, a dentist from Pennsylvania with no military training, no engineering degree, no reason whatsoever to be standing in the desert contemplating the nature of warfare. Yet he stood transfixed by the spectacle, his mind turning over an idea so strange, so audacious, that it seemed to have flown directly from the realm of fever dreams into the hard reality of a world consumed by war. The bats spiraled upward in their nightly exodus, heading out to feast on insects across the southwestern desert, and Adams watched them with the intensity of a man who has just glimpsed the future. A future where these small creatures, no larger than a child's fist, might carry fire into the heart of the enemy and change the course of history without a single human pilot risking their life. It was an absurd thought, a ludicrous proposition, the kind of idea that would normally be dismissed before it even left the lips. Yet this was 1942, and the world had gone mad in ways that made the impossible seem merely improbable. Across the Pacific, Japan held dominion over vast stretches of Asia, its military machine seemingly unstoppable, its cities and industrial centers built largely of wood and paper, structures that would burn with terrifying efficiency if only someone could find a way to set them ablaze from within. In Europe, Hitler's armies carved through nations like a scythe through wheat, and in America, the shock of Pearl Harbor still reverberated through every newspaper headline, every radio broadcast, every conversation in every home where fear and rage had become the daily bread. The nation was mobilizing with a desperation that transformed society itself, factories retooling to produce tanks and planes, young men lining up at recruitment centers, scientists being pulled from universities and laboratories to work on projects so secret that even their families would never know what they had done. In Los Alamos, a mesa in New Mexico was being transformed into a city of physicists racing to unlock the power of the atom, while in Washington, generals and admirals pored over maps and intelligence reports, searching for any advantage, any weapon, any strategy that might bring victory closer. The air itself seemed to vibrate with urgency, a collective holding of breath, a sense that everything familiar was being unmade and remade into something harder, sharper, more terrible. Into this maelstrom of scientific ambition and military necessity came Lytle Adams with his bats, and the remarkable thing, the detail that speaks volumes about the fever pitch of those years, is that people listened. Adams was not entirely unknown. He had some connections, had worked as an inventor of sorts, held patents for various small devices, had the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that marked him as a man of ideas, even if most of those ideas never amounted to much. But he was also friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, a connection that gave him access to corridors of power that would normally remain forever closed to a provincial dentist with a wild theory about weaponized wildlife. He composed a proposal, typed out on a manual typewriter in careful, earnest language that attempted to make the insane sound reasonable, explaining how bats could be collected in vast numbers from the caves of the Southwest, how they could be fitted with small incendiary devices, how they could be packed into containers and dropped from bombers over Japanese cities, where they would disperse at dawn, seeking shelter in the eaves and attics of wooden structures, where the timed fuses would ignite and start thousands of simultaneous fires that no fire brigade could ever hope to contain. The proposal made its way through channels, passed from hand to hand, accumulating notes and stamps and the signatures of men who should have dismissed it immediately but found themselves, instead, intrigued by the sheer audacity of the concept. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who had already proven himself willing to consider unconventional solutions to unprecedented problems, read the proposal in the Oval Office one evening, probably by lamplight, probably with a cigarette burning in the ashtray beside him, and instead of laughing or tossing it aside, he wrote a memo to William J. Donovan, head of what would become the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, instructing him to investigate the feasibility of Adams's bomb. The memo was brief, characteristically direct, bearing that mixture of pragmatism and curiosity that defined Roosevelt's approach to governance in those desperate years, a willingness to explore any avenue that might shorten the war and save American lives, no matter how bizarre it seemed on the surface. Donovan, a man who dealt in espionage and sabotage, who understood that warfare had moved beyond the simple collision of armies into a realm of psychological operations and unconventional tactics, took the proposal seriously, assigning personnel to study it, to determine whether there was any merit beneath the surface strangeness. Thus began Project X-Ray, a program that would consume resources, time, and the sanity of everyone involved, a program that existed at the intersection of legitimate military research and something that felt more like a collective hallucination. The first challenge was simple enough in concept but monumental in execution. They needed bats, millions of them if the project was to succeed, and they needed them quickly. The military turned its attention to Carlsbad Caverns and other bat habitats across the southwest, places where Mexican free-tailed bats gathered in numbers that defied easy comprehension, living caves that exhaled clouds of wings every evening as the sun went down. Teams of soldiers and scientists descended on these locations under cover of darkness, not wanting to draw attention to their activities, though how one keeps secret the mass capture of bats from public caverns remains a question without a satisfactory answer. They used nets and traps, improvised methods of containment, learning through trial and error how to handle creatures that were fragile, panicky, and possessed of sharp teeth and a strong desire not to be handled at all. The bats were transported in crates and cages, loaded onto military trucks that rolled through the desert night like something from a surrealist painting, carrying their cargo of confused, chittering mammals to secret facilities where the real work would begin. At an airfield in New Mexico, far from civilian eyes, a team of scientists and engineers assembled to tackle the next impossible task: creating an incendiary device small enough and light enough for a bat to carry, yet powerful enough to start a significant fire, and doing so in sufficient quantities to equip hundreds of thousands of bats. They worked in hangars and temporary laboratories, surrounded by cages of test subjects, the air filled with the high-pitched vocalizations of distressed animals and the smell of guano and chemicals. The device they eventually developed was a marvel of miniaturization, a tiny napalm bomb weighing less than an ounce, equipped with a timer mechanism that could be set before deployment, the whole thing designed to be attached to the bat's chest with a surgical clip and a piece of string, a grotesque parody of a necklace. The scientists tested and refined, learning how much weight a bat could carry in flight, how to set the timers so the bombs would ignite after the bats had found shelter but before the fires could be easily controlled, how to package the animals so they could be transported and deployed without dying en masse before they ever reached the target. The solution to deployment involved inducing hibernation, a natural state for bats that could be triggered artificially by lowering the temperature, allowing the animals to be packed tightly into compartments within a large cylindrical container that could be loaded into a bomber's bay. The plan called for these containers to be dropped from altitude, falling toward the target city with their cargo of sleeping bats, each one fitted with its tiny bomb, each one a potential arsonist waiting to wake. Parachutes would slow the descent, and at a predetermined altitude, the container would open, spilling its contents into the pre-dawn air, where the warming temperature and the rush of wind would rouse the bats from their artificial sleep. They would scatter, following their instinct to seek dark, enclosed spaces, and in a city built largely of wood and paper, there would be no shortage of attics, eaves, and crawl spaces where they could hide. By the time the sun rose fully, thousands of small fires would bloom simultaneously across the urban landscape, overwhelming any attempt at organized firefighting, creating a conflagration that would consume entire neighborhoods, perhaps entire districts, without a single conventional bomb being dropped. It was madness, but it was methodical madness, backed by research and engineering, supported by men in uniform who produced reports and memos and charts demonstrating that the concept was not only possible but potentially more effective than conventional incendiary bombing. The calculations showed that a single bomber carrying bat bombs could start more fires across a wider area than a squadron of B-29s dropping conventional ordnance, and could do so with precision that targeted the civilian infrastructure rather than simply cratering the ground. There was a cold logic to it, a recognition that modern warfare had evolved beyond the battlefield into something more total, more terrible, where the destruction of the enemy's capacity to wage war meant burning their cities and terrifying their population into surrender. The atomic scientists working in Los Alamos were pursuing the same goal through different means, seeking to harness the fundamental forces of matter itself, but the bat scientists were working with biology, with behavior, with the quirks of evolution that had made these small mammals into perfect nocturnal navigators, and they believed they could turn those evolutionary adaptations into weapons. The first test came on a spring morning in 1943, at a remote desert facility where a mock Japanese village had been constructed, complete with authentic materials shipped from the Pacific Theater, wooden structures with paper screens and traditional architectural details, surrounded by observation posts and firefighting equipment standing ready in case anything went wrong. Military observers gathered, officers and scientists, some skeptical, some genuinely curious, all of them aware that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of warfare. The container was loaded onto a bomber, a standard aircraft modified to carry the experimental payload, and the plane took off into the clear desert sky, climbing to altitude while the men on the ground waited, cameras ready, notebooks open, fire hoses unreeled. The plane made its approach, and somewhere in its belly, mechanisms activated. The container fell away, tumbling briefly before the parachute deployed, and then the shell cracked open, and suddenly the air was full of wings. They had anticipated a dispersal pattern, a controlled release that would see the bats fly off in search of shelter in the mock village below. But what happened instead was chaos. The bats, roused from hibernation abruptly, confused and panicked, scattered in every direction, many of them falling rather than flying, others circling aimlessly, still others heading directly away from the target toward whatever shelter they could find, which in this case meant the hangars and buildings of the actual military base surrounding the test site. The observers watched in growing alarm as their experimental weapons, each carrying a live incendiary device, flew past the intended target and began landing on actual military structures, crawling under eaves, finding their way into ventilation shafts, disappearing into the shadows of equipment storage facilities. The beauty of the theory collapsed instantly into the nightmare of uncontrolled reality. And within minutes, the first fires began. A hangar burst into flames, the dry wood of its construction igniting with shocking speed, the fire spreading along the walls and reaching toward the roof where fuel storage tanks were positioned, a detail that someone should have considered when planning the test but apparently had not. Soldiers ran in all directions, some fighting fires, others trying to capture bats that were still flying around with their tiny bombs attached, creating a scene that would have been comical if it were not so dangerous. A barracks caught fire, then another hangar, then a vehicle depot where the flames found paint thinner and other combustibles that sent black smoke billowing into the sky. The base commander, watching his installation burn, made the decision to evacuate non-essential personnel and call in every available firefighting resource, transforming what was supposed to be a controlled military experiment into a genuine emergency. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Project X-Ray's first major test had successfully demonstrated that bats could indeed burn down structures with terrifying efficiency. Unfortunately, those structures belonged to the United States Army Air Forces rather than the Empire of Japan. In the aftermath, as personnel surveyed the damage and compiled reports, there was a moment when the entire project could have been canceled, when cooler heads could have prevailed and pointed out that weaponizing animals was perhaps not the most reliable path to military victory. But this was not what happened. Instead, the scientists and military planners analyzed what had gone wrong, identified the variables that needed adjustment, proposed modifications to the release mechanism and the timing of the hibernation reversal, and prepared for another round of testing. There was something admirable and terrible about this persistence, this refusal to accept that some ideas are simply too unwieldy to work, this conviction that with enough engineering and enough testing, even the most improbable weapon could be perfected. Money continued to flow into the project, personnel remained assigned, and the bats, those innocent instruments of military ambition, continued to be captured and fitted with their tiny bombs, living brief lives in cages before being deployed in tests that sometimes succeeded in burning the intended targets and sometimes succeeded only in burning everything else. The scientists working on Project X-Ray were not monsters, not men who took pleasure in the suffering of animals or the prospect of burning cities. They were professionals doing a job that had been assigned to them, trying to solve a problem that their nation insisted needed solving. They wrote careful notes about the bats' behavior, tried to minimize stress and suffering in the experimental animals, debated the ethics of what they were doing in quiet conversations over coffee in the mess hall. Some of them had doubts, serious doubts about whether this was the right approach, whether there might be better uses for their talents and their time, but these doubts existed within a larger framework of belief that the war was necessary, that Japan had to be defeated, that American lives were worth more than Japanese lives, and that any weapon that could shorten the conflict was worth developing. This was the logic of total war, the mathematics of acceptable casualties, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that occurs when entire populations are mobilized toward a single goal, and when the enemy is portrayed not as human beings with families and hopes and fears but as a monolithic threat that must be destroyed by any means necessary. Meanwhile, on that mesa in New Mexico, other scientists were making far more significant progress, splitting uranium atoms and measuring the energy released, calculating the chain reactions that could turn a few pounds of refined material into an explosion powerful enough to level an entire city in a single flash. The Manhattan Project was consuming vast resources, pulling in the brightest minds from across the nation and Europe, operating under security protocols that made Project X-ray's secrecy look casual by comparison. Robert Oppenheimer and his team were essentially building a new kind of sun, a weapon that would make all previous weapons obsolete, and they knew it, felt the weight of it in their work, understood that they were crossing a threshold from which humanity could never return. The bat bomb scientists probably did not know about Los Alamos, probably had no idea that their project was being gradually eclipsed by something infinitely more terrible, though some of them might have heard rumors, whispers about a superweapon being developed somewhere in the desert, might have wondered what could possibly be more devastating than tens of thousands of simultaneous fires burning across a city. By 1944, Project X-ray had conducted multiple tests with varying degrees of success, had refined the technology to the point where the deployment mechanism worked more or less as intended, where the bats actually did seek shelter in structures and where the incendiary devices did ignite and start fires that burned with the intense heat of napalm. The project had its advocates in the military, officers who believed that the bat bomb represented a more humane alternative to conventional bombing because it would theoretically cause less explosive destruction and fewer immediate casualties. A reasoning that ignored the fact that burning to death is perhaps no more humane than being blown apart. But this was the kind of moral calculus that war demands, the constant weighing of one horror against another in search of the least terrible option. There were plans to manufacture the devices in massive quantities, to establish breeding colonies of bats that could supply the war effort with millions of tiny bombers, to integrate the bat bomb into the larger strategic bombing campaign that was already reducing German and Japanese cities to ash through conventional means. But the world was changing faster than Project X-ray could adapt, and the change was being driven by physics rather than biology, by equations rather than instinct. In July 1945, in the Jornada del Muerto desert, not far from where the bats had been tested, a plutonium device nicknamed the Gadget was hoisted atop a steel tower and detonated at dawn, releasing energy equivalent to thousands of tons of TNT, vaporizing the tower and turning the sand beneath it into green glass, sending a mushroom cloud rising into the stratosphere, creating light bright enough to be seen in 3 states and heat intense enough to be felt 10 miles away. The scientists who witnessed that test knew immediately that warfare would never be the same, that they had succeeded in creating a weapon so powerful that it rendered all previous weapons almost quaint by comparison. A single bomb that could destroy an entire city in seconds, that required no complicated deployment mechanism, no reliance on animal behavior, no elaborate planning beyond determining the target and releasing the weapon. This was the future of warfare, terrible and efficient and absolute. President Harry Truman, who had inherited the weight of the war from Roosevelt, received the news of the successful test while attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, and he knew immediately what it meant, understood that he now possessed the power to end the war with Japan quickly and decisively, though at a cost that would haunt the conscience of the nation and the world for generations. The decision was made, the orders were given, and on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released a single uranium bomb over Hiroshima, and in the fireball that followed, in the shock wave that leveled buildings and incinerated people in an instant, in the mushroom cloud that rose over the ruins, Project X-ray became instantly and permanently obsolete. 3 days later, another atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, and Japan, faced with a weapon against which there was no defense, no meaningful response, surrendered unconditionally, bringing the war to an end in a way that made all the conventional strategies and experimental weapons programs seem like relics of a more innocent time. The bat bomb scientists learned of the atomic attacks like everyone else, through radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines, and they must have felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the war was over, shock at the scale of the destruction, perhaps a quiet gratitude that their own weapon had never been used, never contributed to the death toll of that terrible conflict. Project X-ray was quietly terminated, the remaining equipment was packed away or destroyed, the bats were released back into the wild or simply allowed to die in their cages, and the scientists and soldiers involved were reassigned to other projects or discharged to return to civilian life. The official records were classified, buried in archives where they would remain secret for decades, the story of the bat bomb becoming one of those strange footnotes to history, a curiosity that revealed something about the desperation and creativity of wartime America, about the willingness to explore any option no matter how unconventional, about the thin line between genius and madness that war has a tendency to erase. Years later, when the story finally became public, when documents were declassified and journalists began piecing together the bizarre history of Project X-ray, The reaction was predictable. Amusement, disbelief, a kind of nostalgic amazement that the military had actually devoted resources to weaponizing bats while simultaneously developing the atomic bomb. It became one of those stories that gets told at dinner parties, a conversation piece, an example of military absurdity that people could laugh about because it had never actually been used, never actually killed anyone, never contributed to the nightmare that the war became. But there was something deeper in the story, something more troubling than mere absurdity, a revelation about the nature of modern warfare and the transformation that occurs when nations mobilize all their creative and scientific capacity toward the goal of destruction. Project X-ray represented a kind of innocence, a belief that war could be waged with precision and cleverness, that the right application of technology and biology could achieve military objectives without crossing certain moral lines. But that innocence was shattered on August 6, 1945, when it became clear that warfare had evolved beyond such limitations, that humanity now possessed weapons that could not be controlled or contained, that would change everything about international relations, and the balance of power and the existential risks facing civilization itself. The scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project were forced to confront this transformation, were forced to live with the knowledge that they had built the weapon that killed hundreds of thousands of people in seconds, that had introduced the possibility of human extinction through nuclear war, and many of them spent the rest of their lives wrestling with the moral implications of what they had done, some becoming advocates for arms control and nuclear disarmament, others defending their work as necessary to end the war and prevent even greater casualties that would have resulted from a land invasion of Japan. The bat bomb scientists were spared that burden, their weapon never used, their contribution to the war effort a mere curiosity rather than a trauma embedded in the collective memory of humanity. Yet they too must have wondered about the path not taken, about what would have happened if their project had succeeded on schedule, if the bat bombs had been deployed before the atomic bomb was ready, if Japanese cities had burned from 10,000 simultaneous fires rather than from a single nuclear explosion. There were military analysts after the war who argued that Project X-ray might actually have been more effective than the atomic bomb in certain respects, that the widespread fire damage would have been more difficult to recover from than the localized destruction of a nuclear blast, that the psychological impact of invisible attackers setting fires throughout the city might have been more terrifying than even the awesome power of atomic weapons. These analyses remained theoretical, counterfactual exercises in what if, but they suggested that the bat bomb was not quite as absurd as it seemed, that there was real strategic thinking behind the concept, that in a world where the atomic bomb had never been developed, Project X-ray might have become a genuine weapon of war. The fact that it did not, that it remains instead a strange footnote, a story that elicits laughter and head-shaking, speaks to the scale of the transformation that the atomic bomb represented, the way it rendered obsolete not just the bat bomb but an entire category of military thinking. In the decades that followed the war, as the archives slowly opened and researchers began documenting the full scope of wartime research programs, Project X-ray emerged as emblematic of a particular kind of American approach to problems. Audacious, willing to consider unconventional solutions, unafraid of failure, possessed of a confidence that borders on hubris. The same spirit that led to the bat bomb also led to the atomic bomb, to the space program, to countless technological innovations that transformed modern life, but it also led to weapon systems that never worked, to experimental programs that consumed resources without producing results, to a military-industrial complex that sometimes seemed more interested in the research than in the practical applications. Project X-ray was remarkable not because it succeeded but because it was attempted at all, because someone stood in the desert watching bats emerge from a cave and thought, I can turn that into a weapon. And because the military apparatus of the most powerful nation on Earth took that idea seriously enough to devote time and money and personnel to making it work. The moral questions raised by Project X-ray are more subtle than those raised by the atomic bomb, but they are questions worth considering nonetheless. What does it mean to weaponize nature, to take creatures that evolved over millions of years to fill a particular ecological niche and transform them into instruments of war? What responsibility do scientists have when they are asked to develop weapons, when they are told that their work might save lives by ending the war more quickly, when they are operating within a framework of national emergency that makes dissent seem unpatriotic? These questions did not end with the war, they have persisted through every subsequent conflict, through the development of chemical and biological weapons, through the use of napalm in Vietnam and depleted uranium in Iraq, through drone warfare and autonomous weapons systems that remove human decision-making from the act of killing. The bat bomb seems quaint now, almost innocent in its mechanical simplicity, but it was part of a continuum, a progression of increasingly impersonal and devastating weapons that characterizes modern warfare. There is a photograph from the Project X-ray files, recently declassified, that shows a scientist holding a bat fitted with its tiny incendiary bomb. The animal's wings spread wide, its face showing what might be fear or might be nothing more than the natural expression of a creature caught in unfamiliar hands. The scientist is smiling, clearly pleased with the ingenuity of the device, proud of the engineering that allowed such a small package to carry such destructive potential, and the contrast between the smile and the purpose is unsettling. A reminder that the people who develop weapons are not necessarily evil, are often simply professionals doing their jobs with skill and dedication, finding satisfaction in solving technical problems without fully confronting the implications of their solutions. That photograph could have been taken at any weapons laboratory in any era. The details would change, but the essential dynamic would remain the same. Human intelligence applied to the problem of destruction, creativity harnessed to the goal of killing more efficiently, the separation between means and ends that allows good people to participate in terrible projects. The veterans of Project X-ray rarely spoke about their work, partly because it remained classified for so long, partly because there was something embarrassing about admitting that you had spent years of your life trying to turn bats into bombs while the real war was being won by conventional forces and ultimately ended by weapons so powerful they defied comprehension. When they did speak, in interviews conducted years later when they were old men looking back on their youth, they tended to emphasize the camaraderie, the sense of being part of something important, the satisfaction of working on a challenging technical problem, and they downplayed the violence implicit in their work, spoke of it as a job that needed doing, a contribution to the war effort that seemed necessary at the time even if it looked ridiculous in retrospect. This is how most people make sense of their participation in historical events that have moral dimensions they cannot fully control or understand. They focus on the immediate, the personal, the relationships and challenges that define their daily experience, and they allow the larger questions to remain abstract, theoretical, someone else's problem. In the end, Project X-ray tells us something about the Second World War that we might prefer not to acknowledge. That the line between the rational and the absurd grew very thin during those years, that desperation pushed people to consider options that would never have been contemplated in peacetime, that the urgency of defeating fascism made almost any means seem justified, at least temporarily. The war was won by conventional forces, by brave soldiers and brilliant generals and overwhelming industrial production, but it was also won by scientists who were willing to explore every possibility, to test every hypothesis, to develop weapons that ranged from the merely novel to the apocalyptic, and the bat bomb sits somewhere on that spectrum as a reminder that not every experiment succeeds, not every innovative idea leads to practical applications, but the willingness to try, to push boundaries, to imagine the previously unimaginable, defines a particular kind of civilization at a particular moment in history. Somewhere in a warehouse, probably in the vast archives maintained by the National Archives or in the storage facilities of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, there are boxes marked Project X-ray, containing documents and photographs and perhaps even some of the original equipment, the release containers and the miniature incendiary devices and the surgical clips used to attach them to bats, all of it carefully preserved for historical purposes, all of it gathering dust while researchers occasionally request access to write papers and articles about this strange chapter in military history. If you were to open those boxes to handle those artifacts, you would be touching objects that embody a particular kind of madness, a moment when war had become so total, so consuming, that weaponizing bats seemed like a reasonable idea, when the normal barriers between the natural world and human conflict collapsed entirely, when anything that could burn and anything that could fly became a potential weapon in the arsenal of democracy. The story of Project X-ray is often told as comedy, as an example of military folly that we can laugh at safely from the distance of decades, but it is also tragedy, not because of what it accomplished but because of what it represented. The transformation of imagination into a tool of destruction, the harnessing of scientific knowledge to the goal of causing maximum suffering, the willingness to experiment on living creatures in service of killing other living creatures more efficiently. The atomic bomb ended the war and changed history, but the bat bomb reveals something about the mindset that made the atomic bomb possible, about a culture that could simultaneously pursue the most absurd and the most devastating weapons with equal seriousness, that could devote resources to projects that ranged from the impractical to the apocalyptic, that measured success in terms of how much damage could be inflicted rather than how much peace could be achieved. At Carlsbad Caverns today, tourists gather at dusk to watch the bats emerge, just as Lytle Adams did in 1942, and the sight remains spectacular. a natural phenomenon that speaks to the mystery and beauty of the living world. And if the tour guides mention Project X-ray at all, it is usually as an amusing anecdote, a strange bit of local history that adds color to the experience without requiring too much reflection on what it meant or what it says about us. The bats spiral upward into the twilight, heading out on their nightly hunt for insects, and they are magnificent in their purposeful flight, in their evolutionary perfection, in their complete indifference to human affairs. And perhaps there is something redemptive in that indifference, in the knowledge that nature continues regardless of what we try to make of it, that the bats survived Project X-ray and survived the war and continue their ancient patterns of migration and hibernation and reproduction as they have for millions of years and will continue for millions more if we do not destroy the ecosystems they depend upon. The final report on Project X-ray, filed in 1944 and classified for decades, concluded that the bat bomb was technically feasible and could potentially be effective in the right circumstances, but recommended that resources be directed elsewhere given the development of other strategic weapons that showed more immediate promise. It was a bureaucratic way of saying that the project had failed, that the dream of fire-bearing bats had proven too difficult to control, too dependent on variables that could not be managed, too unreliable for actual combat deployment. The men who wrote that report probably felt relief that they could move on to other assignments, that they would not be responsible for the operational use of a weapon that seemed increasingly bizarre the more they worked with it, and they filed away their notes and their data and their photographs and went home to their families and rarely thought about those years again. But history remembers, or at least history preserves, and in the preservation lies a lesson for every generation that faces the temptation to weaponize the natural world, to treat living creatures as mere instruments, to allow the urgency of conflict to override ethical considerations that should remain sacrosanct regardless of circumstance. Project X-ray was not the worst thing done during World War II, not by several orders of magnitude, not compared to the Holocaust or the atomic bombings or the firebombing of Dresden or the rape of Nanking or any of the other horrors that characterized that global conflagration, but it was part of the same mindset, the same willingness to treat anything and everything as potential weapons, to measure value only in terms of destructive capacity, to forget that how we fight is as important as why we fight, that means cannot be endlessly separated from ends without corrupting both. The dentist from Pennsylvania, Lytle Adams, lived until 1970, long enough to see his invention become declassified, long enough to give interviews about Project X-ray, and he apparently remained proud of his contribution to the war effort, convinced that if circumstances had been different, if the atomic bomb had not arrived when it did, his bat bomb might have helped win the war with fewer casualties than the alternatives. He died believing that his idea had merit, that the execution rather than the concept had been the problem, and who can say with certainty that he was wrong? War is the realm of counterfactuals, of paths not taken, of weapons not used and strategies not attempted, and the bat bomb remains one of those intriguing might-have-beens, a weapon that existed on the edge of practicality without quite tipping over into operational reality. In the end, standing in that New Mexico desert with the sun setting and the bats beginning their nightly exodus from the caves, watching them pour into the darkening sky in numbers that still impress despite everything we have done to their habitats and their populations, it is possible to feel both wonder at the natural world and shame at what we tried to make of it, gratitude that the bat bomb was never used in anger and sorrow that it was conceived at all. War is where imagination meets desperation, where the best and worst of human creativity are unleashed simultaneously, where the same species that composes symphonies and writes poetry also designs weapons of indiscriminate destruction and convinces itself that such designs are necessary, even noble, certainly justified by the righteousness of the cause and the necessity of victory. The bats know nothing of this, care nothing for our wars and our weapons. They simply fly into the night seeking food and shelter, following instincts older than human civilization, older than agriculture and writing and all the technologies that allowed us to organize ourselves into nations capable of waging global war. And perhaps in their indifference there is wisdom, a reminder that the natural world operates according to principles that do not include human conflict, that the universe continues its ancient rhythms regardless of what we do to ourselves and each other, that the bats will outlast our wars and our weapons and our certainty that we know how the world should work. Project X-ray is over, has been over for 80 years, but its ghost haunts every weapons laboratory where scientists work on the next generation of military technology, every meeting where military planners consider unconventional approaches to strategic problems, every moment when someone looks at the natural world and thinks not, how beautiful, but how useful, how profitable, how deadly if properly deployed. The containers are rusted, the documents are yellowing in archives, the scientists and soldiers involved are mostly dead, but the lesson persists for anyone willing to learn it. That imagination without ethics is dangerous, that technical skill without moral reflection leads to horrors both grand and small, that the ability to do something is not the same as the wisdom to refrain from doing it, and that sometimes, perhaps most times, the craziest dreams should remain exactly that. Dreams never. Flight.